The storm had moved through like something with a grudge. Ronan Vale stood at the edge of what remained of their camp and looked at the damage with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that anger costs more than it returns. The canvas shelter was gone, not torn, not collapsed, but entirely gone, carried off somewhere into the gray morning distance as though the desert had simply decided it didn't belong here. The cook fire stones had been scattered. One of the supply crates had been overturned, and the flour was a pale ghost stain spreading across the red dirt, already hardening in the early heat. The mule, Gideon, stood 20 yards away, with his ears flat and his expression one of profound personal offense. "Well," Morel said from behind him. "Yeah," Ronan said. That was often how they spoke after a setback. They had developed a language of compression over 4 years of marriage, 4 years of moving through the territory following work that always seemed to be ending just as they arrived. Mining camps that had played out, a ranch outside Flagstaff where the owner had paid them in promises, a brief, bright season in Prescott where Morel had taken in laundry and Ronan had worked timber, and they had almost saved enough to do something permanent, until the fire. They did not talk about the fire. Morel crouched and began collecting what could be collected. She was a practical woman with dark hair she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed hat, and a face that had been pretty once in a soft way and was now pretty in a harder, more interesting way. She did not catastrophize. She did not linger. She moved through difficulty the way water moves through a narrow channel, finding the path forward without ceremony. "We need to move before the next one comes," she said. "Sky looks like it's thinking about it." Ronan looked west. She was right. There was a particular yellow-gray quality to the horizon that he had learned to distrust. Cinder Wash is maybe 3 miles. There's a rock formation I saw from the ridge yesterday. Could give us shelter while we figure out what's next. What is next? He picked up the overturned crate and didn't answer right away, because he didn't have an answer that was worth the air it would take to say it. What was next was the same thing that was always next. Keep moving, keep looking, keep hoping that the territory would eventually yield something that felt like a future, instead of just more territory. "Let's get to the wash," he said. They reached Cinder Wash by mid-morning. The wash itself was dry now, but showed the evidence of last night's violence. Debris lines high on the banks, scoured stone, the wet, dark smell of recent water already beginning to bake off under the climbing sun. The rock formation Ronan had spotted from the ridge was a low, red escarpment that ran along the western edge of the wash, and it offered a decent windbreak and some overhang that would serve as shelter if the sky followed through on its threat. They made camp in the practical, wordless way of people who have made camp too many times. Gideon was hobbled and given water from the barrel they'd managed to keep upright. Morel sorted the salvageable supplies into 2 piles, the things they needed immediately and the things they could afford to lose if they had to move fast. The pile of things they could afford to lose was larger than the other pile, and she looked at it for a moment with an expression Ronan recognized. Not despair, exactly, but something adjacent to it, the expression of a woman doing arithmetic on her life and not liking the sum. He touched her shoulder as he passed. She reached up and pressed his hand briefly, without looking at him. He walked the perimeter of the camp the way he always did, checking the ground, checking the sky, reading the land for anything useful or dangerous. The escarpment was solid. the overhang would hold. The soil near the wash was still damp from the runoff, and he could see the tracks of small animals. A rabbit. Something with narrow clawed feet he couldn't identify, which meant there was probably water nearby even when the wash was dry. That was something. He was walking along the far edge of the escarpment, maybe 40 yards from camp, when the ground moved. Not an earthquake, not a tremor, just a single, sudden giving way beneath his left boot, a hollow, crumbling sound, and then his leg dropped to the knee into the earth as though the desert had simply opened its mouth and taken a bite of him. He threw himself backward and landed hard on his palms, heart hammering, and looked at what had happened. There was a crack in the ground. It had been there before. He could see that now, looking at it from a safe distance. A narrow fissure running roughly north to south, maybe 15 feet long, partially concealed by a shelf of flat stone that had apparently been holding for years and had chosen this particular moment, weakened by the storm's runoff seeping beneath it, to give way. The stone had dropped inward. The crack was now perhaps 2 feet wide at its widest point, narrowing at both ends, and from it came something that made no sense at all. Cool air, faintly damp, and beneath that, so subtle he thought at first, he was imagining it. The green smell of living things. Ronan Vale sat in the dirt of the Arizona Territory in the year 1891 and stared at a hole in the ground that smelled like a garden. And for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, he felt something shift in his chest that was not worry and was not exhaustion and was not the careful management of hope that he had learned to practice the way other men practiced economy. He felt curious. "Morel," he called. "Come look at this." She brought the rope without being asked. That was one of the things Ronan loved about his wife. The way her mind moved ahead of the moment. The way she arrived at the practical solution before he had finished explaining the problem. She had heard something in his voice, some particular quality of stillness, and she had untied the coil from Gideon's pack and walked the 40 yards with it over her shoulder. And when she saw the crack in the ground and the broken shelf of stone and the darkness below, she simply handed him the rope and looked down into it. "How far?" she asked. "Don't know. I can't see the bottom. You can smell it, though." It wasn't a question. She had already caught it. The impossible green smell rising from the dark. Ronan tied one end of the rope to a heavy outcrop of the escarpment and tested it 3 times with his full weight. Then he looked at Morel, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that was part permission and part warning and part the specific understanding of 2 people who have spent 4 years making decisions together in circumstances that did not allow for lengthy deliberation. "Be careful," she said. "Always. You are never always careful. I'm carefully sometimes careful." She almost smiled. "Go." He went. The crack was tight at the surface. He had to angle his shoulders and go down sideways, the rope rough in his hands, the broken stone edges scraping his back. For the first 10 feet, it was just darkness and the smell of damp rock, and he had a bad moment where the walls seemed to press inward, and he thought about the weight of the earth above him and made himself stop thinking about it. Then the crack widened. Then it widened dramatically, and his feet found nothing, and he was hanging free in open air. He let himself down hand over hand, turning slowly on the rope, and the darkness below him began to separate into shapes as his eyes adjusted. The basin was perhaps 60 feet across and 30 feet deep, a natural bowl in the earth with walls of red and ochre stone that curved inward slightly at the top, narrowing to the crack through which the sky showed as a pale bright slot above him. The walls were not sheer. They were terraced in places, irregular, with ledges and protrusions and one long diagonal shelf that ran along the northern wall like a natural bench. The floor was not bare rock. It was soil, dark, damp, improbable soil, and growing from it were trees. He hung on the rope and stared. Fig trees, 4 of them, gnarled and ancient-looking, their roots driven deep into the basin floor, their canopies spreading wide in the space below the crack, where the sunlight poured down in a shifting column. Climbing vines on the southern wall, thick as his wrist at the base, leafed out in deep green. A patch of something low and dense near the eastern wall that might have been wild herbs, and in the far corner, where the northern and eastern walls met, a spring. Just a seep, really, a dark, wet line in the rock face above a small pool no larger than a washtub, clear and still and surrounded by a fringe of moss so intensely green it looked painted. Ronan's boots touched the ground. He let go of the rope. He stood in the hidden basin in the Arizona territory and turned in a slow circle and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Then he saw the steps. They were cut into the eastern wall, not carved with any great precision, but deliberately made. 8 of them, wide and flat, leading up to the diagonal shelf he had noticed from above. And on the shelf, built into the wall itself, was the ruin of a structure. Stone walls, low and thick, roofless now. The interior open to the sky, a hearth in the near corner, its stones blackened and partly collapsed, but unmistakably a hearth, the kind built to last, with a narrow flue channel cut into the wall above it to carry smoke up toward the crack. And in the far corner of the roofless room, the frame of something that had once been a door, the wood rotted to gray softness, but the shape still clear, still standing in its stone surround. Someone had lived here. Someone had found this place, or made it, or some combination of both, and had built a home in the hidden dark of the earth, and had lived in it, and had eventually left or died, and the desert had grown over the crack above, and the trees had kept growing, and the spring had kept seeping, and the whole impossible place had simply waited. Ronan sat down on the bottom step and put his face in his hands, not from grief, not from exhaustion, from something he didn't have a clean word for, the feeling of a door opening in a wall you didn't know had a door in it. He sat there for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the spring and cupped water in his hands and drank. It was cold and clean and tasted of stone. He filled his canteen. He walked to the nearest fig tree and pressed his palm against the bark and looked up through the leaves at the slot of sky above. Then he climbed back up the rope. Morel was sitting at the edge of the crack with her legs folded under her, watching the rope. When his head appeared, she let out a breath she had apparently been holding for some time. "Well?" she said. Ronan climbed out and sat beside her in the dirt and looked at the sky and at the wash and at the red escarpment and at the whole indifferent, beautiful emptiness of the territory around them. "I think," he said carefully, "that we need to have a conversation about where we're going to live." They did not decide quickly. That was not their way. They spent the rest of that day and all of the next in careful examination. Morel, going down the rope herself on the second morning, Ronan watching from above as she moved through the basin with the methodical attention she brought to everything that mattered. She tested the spring water. She examined the fig trees for disease. She pressed her fingers into the soil and brought them to her nose. She climbed the stone steps and stood in the ruined room for a long time, touching the walls, looking at the hearth, running her hand along the door frame. When she came back up, she sat across from Ronan, and they looked at each other in the late afternoon light. "The spring won't run dry," she said. "It's coming from deep. You can feel it. The pressure is steady. The trees are healthy. Old. Older than either of us. Older than both of us put together, maybe." She paused. "The room can be roofed. The hearth can be rebuilt. The walls are sound. Whoever built them knew what they were doing. It would take time. It would take a lot of time. We don't have money for materials. We have the wagon. We have tools. There's timber in the hills north of here. I saw it from the ridge." She looked at her hands. "What we have is time, Ronan. We have always had time. We just never had a place to spend it." He nodded slowly. "Nobody knows it's here. Nobody. We'd have to be careful, keep the camp up here looking ordinary, not draw attention. We're good at not drawing attention." There was a dry humor in her voice. "We've been invisible to prosperity for 4 years. We can be invisible to everything else." He looked at the crack in the ground. From here, with the broken stone replaced, or rather, with a careful wooden cover built to fit over it, it would be invisible. Just another feature of the desert floor. Just another nothing in a landscape full of nothings. "It would be ours," he said. It came out quieter than he intended. Morel looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It would be ours." The work began the following week and did not stop for 3 months. Ronan drove the wagon north into the timbered hills and came back with rough-cut pine, making 4 trips over as many weeks, each time choosing a different route, each time leaving the wagon in a different spot so that no clear track would develop to lead anyone curious toward Cinder Wash. He built a wooden platform on a rope and pulley system that could lower materials into the basin and raise waste rock out of it. He rebuilt the hearthstone by stone, studying the original construction before he dismantled it, trying to understand the thinking of the person who had built it first. The flue channel was the hardest part. He spent 3 days on it, lying on his back in the narrow cut in the wall, chipping and fitting and testing until the draw was clean. Morel worked the soil. She cleared the basin floor of debris, composted what she could, turned the dark earth with a short-handled spade she'd had since Prescott. She found, under a collapsed section of the eastern wall, a clay pot sealed with a stone lid, and inside it, impossibly, heartbreakingly, seeds. Dried beans, a few shriveled kernels of something that might have been squash, and a small cloth packet of herb seeds she couldn't immediately identify, but planted anyway, in a careful row near the spring. She talked to the fig trees while she worked. She did not tell Ronan this for several weeks. They roofed the room with pine beams and a layer of packed earth and desert grass, thick enough to hold heat in the cold desert nights and shed the rare rain. They built a proper door from the pine, hung on iron hinges Ronan had brought from a hardware store in a small town 30 miles east, paying cash and giving a false name out of a caution he couldn't entirely justify, but didn't ignore. They built a sleeping platform against the north wall, raised off the ground with storage beneath it. They built a table. They built 2 chairs. Morel made a window, a narrow, horizontal slot in the south wall, just below the level of the shelf, that looked out into the basin and let in the morning light when the sun came through the crack above. She fitted it with a shutter of woven desert grass that could be opened or closed. On the day she finished it, she opened it and stood at the table and looked out at the fig trees and the spring and the green climbing vines on the far wall, and the morning light came through the window and lay across the table in a long, warm bar, and she stood in it for a while without moving. Ronan found her there when he came down from the surface. He stood in the doorway and looked at her standing in the light. "The cover fits," he said. "You can't see the opening from 10 feet away." She turned and looked at him. Her face was dusty, and her hands were calloused, and there was a smear of clay on her jaw, and she looked. He searched for the word and found it. She looked settled. For the first time in 4 years, she looked like a woman who knew where she was. "Come look at the window," she said. He came and stood beside her and looked out the window at their hidden world. "I planted the beans yesterday," she said, "and I think the herb seeds are coming up. I can't tell what they are yet." "We'll find out?" "Yes." She leaned against him slightly. "We'll find out?" By November, they were living below. Not entirely. They maintained the surface camp with enough presence to satisfy anyone passing through, which was almost no one. Cinder Wash was not on any road that mattered. The territory was full of empty places, and this was simply one of them, indistinguishable from the rest to any eye that wasn't looking for something specific. Ronan kept a bedroll and a fire pit and a few crates arranged above in a way that suggested recent occupation without suggesting permanence. Gideon lived on the surface, hobbled near the escarpment where the grazing was adequate, and his presence was the most natural explanation for any signs of human activity in the area. But they slept below. They ate below. They read below, by the light of oil lamps hung from iron hooks Ronan had driven into the stone walls. They talked below, in the particular quiet of the basin, a deep, insulated silence broken only by the small sounds of the spring and the occasional movement of air through the crack above, a low harmonic note that they came to think of as the house breathing. Morel's garden grew with a speed that seemed improbable until she understood the reason for it. The basin held warmth the way a clay pot holds water, the stone walls absorbing the sun that came through the crack and releasing it slowly through the night, creating a microclimate that was measurably warmer than the surface. The beans came up strong. The mystery herbs revealed themselves as a variety of wild sage she didn't recognize, with a sharper, sweeter smell than the common kind, and she used them in everything. One of the fig trees produced fruit in late October, small, dark, intensely sweet, and she dried most of it on a flat stone in the direct sunlight and stored it in the clay pot she'd found in the wall. Ronan worked the structure constantly, always finding something to improve. He extended the shelf along the northern wall and built a second room, smaller, rougher, that he could sell in town on their occasional supply runs. He found, in the basin floor near the spring, a section of soil that was different from the rest, darker, more compact, with a faint iridescence when the light hit it at a certain angle. He dug down carefully and found, 3 feet below the surface, a layer of clay so pure and workable that Morel spent an entire week doing nothing but pulling it out and shaping it into pots and bowls and setting them to dry on the ledges in the sunlight column. They made supply runs every 3 weeks, driving to different towns, buying only what they couldn't produce or make themselves, paying in cash from the small reserve they had arrived with and the small additions Ronan made from selling his leather work. They were careful about what they said and to whom. They were careful about the story they told. A couple moving through, looking for work, no fixed address. The story was not even entirely a lie. It was just incomplete. On a cold December evening, Ronan came down from the surface and found Morel sitting at the table with a lamp and a book she had been carrying in the bottom of a supply crate since Prescott, unread for 18 months. She had the window shutter open, and the lamplight fell across the page, and the faint light of a desert moon fell through the crack above and lay in a pale bar across the basin floor, and the spring made its small, constant sound, and the sage smell was in the air. He stood in the doorway and watched her read. She looked up. "You're letting the cold in." He came in and closed the door. He sat in the other chair and looked at the fire in the hearth, his rebuilt hearth, drawing clean and steady, the smoke going up through the channel in the wall and dispersing through sky. He looked at the walls around him, which he had built or rebuilt with his own hands. He looked at the table, which he had made. He looked at the window, which Morel had made. "I've been thinking," he said. She turned a page. "About what?" "About what this is. What we're doing here." She lowered the book slightly. "What are we doing here?" "Living," he said. It came out simply, without weight, the way true things sometimes do. "I think we're just living." Morel looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the fire. Then she looked back at her book. "Yes," she said. "I think that's right." Spring came to the basin before it came to the surface. Ronan noticed it first in the fig trees. A new softness in the branches, a faint green haze of budding that appeared in late February, while the surface world was still locked in the cold brown patience of the desert winter. He stood in the basin in the early morning light and watched the column of sunlight move across the floor, as it always did, tracking the sun's path across the narrow slot of sky above. And he thought about the person who had built the hearth and the steps and the doorframe. He thought about them often, had thought about them all winter, who they were, where they had come from, why they had left. He had found one other artifact, a small iron medallion, no larger than a coin, discovered under the hearthstones when he had dismantled them to rebuild. It was stamped with a design he couldn't identify, a circle with something inside it, worn too smooth to read clearly. He had shown it to Morel, and she had turned it over in her hands and said nothing for a while, and then set it on the table and left it there. And it had stayed there all winter, a small dark presence between the lamp and the clay pot of dried figs. He didn't know if the original builder had been Spanish, a mission man perhaps, or a trader, or someone fleeing something the way people in territories were often fleeing something. He didn't know if they had been there for years or only a season. He didn't know if they had been happy. He hoped they had been happy, he thought, looking at the care evident in every stone of the hearth and every step cut into the wall, that they had been or had wanted to be, which was sometimes the same thing. Morel came out of the house in the early morning with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one and stood beside him looking at the fig trees. "The beans are coming back," she said. The ones I let go to seed. They're already up. Already? 4 inches? She sipped her coffee. This place grows things faster than it should. The warmth. The warmth. And something else. I don't know what. She looked up at the crack of sky above. It wants to grow things. It's been waiting to grow things. Ronan thought about that. The basin had been sealed, or nearly sealed, for years before the storm broke the stone shelf and let him fall through. All that time, the spring seeping, the trees growing, the soil deepening, waiting. He found he liked that idea. He found it comforting in a way he couldn't fully articulate. I've been thinking about the winter, Morel said. Which part? All of it. She turned the cup in her hands. I've been thinking about how it was the first winter I didn't spend half of it afraid. Ronan looked at her. Not afraid of the cold. Not afraid of running out of something. Not afraid of having to move. She paused. I just lived through it. Like a normal person. Like someone who has a place to live through things in. He nodded slowly. He understood. He had felt it too. The particular absence of a fear so constant, you stop noticing it until it's gone. The fear of groundlessness, of being always in motion, always provisional, always one bad season from nothing. We should talk about what comes next, he said. I know. We can't stay invisible forever. We'll need to establish something eventually. Some kind of legal claim, if that's possible. Some kind of... I know, she said again. But not yet. He looked at her. Not yet, she said. Let us have this. Let us have the spring first. Let us have the beans coming up, and the figs, and the sage, and the walls wheat. He was quiet for a moment. The morning light was moving across the basin floor, warm and slow, touching the spring and making it briefly bright. 1 year, he said. 1 year. He drank his coffee. Above them, through the crack in the earth, the Arizona sky was going from gray to gold, the way it did, the way it always did, indifferent and magnificent. Down here, the light came in, filtered and particular, a guest rather than an overwhelming presence, and it lit the basin in a way that made everything in it look deliberate. The trees, the spring, the stone walls, the 2 people standing with their coffee cups in the early morning. Gideon made a sound from somewhere above, a complaint about something. The mule's preferred mode of communication. I'll go up and check on him, Ronan said. Bring more water when you come back down. I want to water the new beans. He set his cup on the table inside and climbed the stone steps and went up the rope through the crack in the earth, and the desert morning received him, cold and wide and smelling of nothing but rock and distance. He checked the mule, who had complaints about the quality of the grazing and expressed them at length. He stood for a moment at the edge of the crack and looked down into the darkness below, which was not really darkness, but a different kind of light. He could hear Morel moving in the house below, the small sounds of a morning, a pot set down, a shutter opened, the soft percussion of ordinary life being lived in a place that had been made for it. He filled the water bucket from the barrel and lowered it on the pulley and heard her take it at the bottom. Then he went back down into the ground, into the warm and growing dark, into the home they had made in the hidden place the storm had given them. Above, the desert went on as it always had, empty, indifferent, keeping their secret without even knowing it had one. Below, the spring seeped and the trees grew, and the sage put out new shoots in the warming soil, and Ronan and Morel Vale lived their quiet, extraordinary, invisible life, one day at a time, one season at a time, in the crack in the world that had opened just for them.